There is a moment in Crocodile Dundee that most people have watched dozens of times without thinking twice about it. The water. The tension. The enormous reptile gliding through the murky surface. Sue Charlton frozen in fear before Mick Dundee steps in to save the day. Audiences laughed, cheered, and moved on with their popcorn. But what if the fear on Linda Kozlowski's face in that scene was not acting at all? What if the danger lurking just beyond the frame was entirely, terrifyingly real? And what if the people who knew the full story had been quietly asked not to talk about it? This is one of those chapters in Hollywood history that gets glossed over in interviews, buried under the excitement of box office numbers and celebrity gossip. But once you hear what actually happened on that remote Australian set, you will never watch that scene the same way again. This is the story of a young actress who walked into a role that could have ended her life before it ever truly began, and who handled it with a kind of grace that very few people in that industry could have managed. To understand why Linda Kozlowski's story hits so hard, you have to go back to where it started. Not the red carpets. Not the premiere nights. Not the glamorous magazine covers. You have to go back to the version of her life that existed before any of that. Back when she was just another ambitious young woman trying to find her footing in one of the most unforgiving cities on earth. Hollywood in the mid-1980s was not a welcoming place for unknown actresses. The competition was fierce, the opportunities were narrow, and the industry had a very particular idea of who deserved a shot and who did not. Linda was grinding through auditions, picking up small roles here and there, nothing that would turn heads or pay the bills comfortably. She was doing what countless talented performers do in that city. She was surviving, waiting, and hoping that one door would eventually swing open wide enough to let her through. The door, when it finally came, did not look like the opportunity of a lifetime. Not at first. A quirky little Australian film about a crocodile hunter. A modest budget. A lead actor who was well loved back home in Australia but largely unknown to American audiences. The whole project had the energy of a fun gamble rather than a guaranteed hit. Industry insiders were not exactly racing to place their bets on it. But Linda saw something in the character of Sue Charlton, a sharp and independent New York journalist thrown into the wild Australian outback, that felt worth pursuing. She went after the role with everything she had. Landing it changed everything. Not immediately. Not overnight. But it set in motion a series of events that would take her from obscurity to global recognition, from struggling auditions to one of the most talked about debuts in 1980s cinema. What no one told her beforehand, was exactly what she was signing up for when those cameras started rolling thousands of miles from the comfort of any Hollywood studio. There is a massive difference between filming in a carefully controlled environment and filming in a place where nature genuinely does not care that you are making a movie. The Australian Outback falls firmly into that second category. It is one of the most raw, unfiltered, and genuinely dangerous landscapes on the planet. Beautiful in a way that photographs can barely capture, but dangerous in a way that no amount of preparation fully prepares you for. When the production of Crocodile Dundee packed up and headed to the remote regions of the Australian wilderness, they were stepping into a living, breathing ecosystem that operated on its own rules entirely. The crew could set their schedules, plan their shots, and rehearse their scenes all they wanted. But the Outback did not negotiate. The Outback did not take breaks. The Outback simply continued doing what it had always done, completely indifferent to the fact that a film crew had arrived with cameras and ambitions. The heat alone was something else. Oppressive, relentless, the kind that drains you before you have even started your day. Then there were the insects. People who have only ever experienced mosquitoes in a temperate climate cannot really comprehend what the Australian bush throws at you. Flies that swarm your face. Insects that crawl into spaces you would rather not think about. Venomous spiders that treat the underside of equipment bags and costume boxes like perfectly acceptable homes. And snakes. Everywhere. The kind of snakes that rank among the deadliest on the planet, moving through the grass with terrifying ease and absolutely zero concern for anything standing in their path. All of this was the background noise of daily life on that set. Every morning you woke up and reminded yourself to check your shoes. Every walk to the filming location was an exercise in vigilance. Every moment spent outside required a certain quiet awareness that most people in the entertainment industry never have to develop. For the crew, it became routine after a while, the way any extreme situation eventually becomes normalized when you are immersed in it long enough. But the normalization never fully erased the anxiety. It just pushed it a little further back in your mind. For Linda Kozlowski, this was the world she had stepped into. A young actress from the United States, accustomed to the rhythms of city life and studio work, suddenly living and working in one of the most isolated and hazardous environments imaginable. And that was before you even got to the crocodiles. Here is the detail that changes everything. Linda Kozlowski's accommodation during the shoot was a modest little hut. Rustic, simple, basic. The kind of setup that adds authenticity to a location shoot and keeps costs down. It sat close enough to the water to make the setting feel genuinely remote and cinematic. What it also sat close to was a billabong. A body of water that the local community knew very well. A body of water that had developed a very specific, very unsettling reputation. Crocodiles had been living in and around that billabong for a long time. And not the kind of crocodiles that keep a shy distance from human activity. These were animals that had grown large, comfortable, and bold. Linda herself would later describe them in terms that are almost casual but carry enormous weight when you let them sink in. She talked about how huge they were. How fat. How utterly unbothered they seemed by the presence of humans nearby. These were apex predators operating in their natural territory, and they had no reason whatsoever to feel threatened by a film crew setting up lights and cameras along their waterway. The proximity of her hut to that billabong meant that something as simple as walking outside at night was not a casual activity. It was a calculated decision. You thought about where you were going. You thought about how far from the water you were staying. You thought about the darkness and what it might be hiding. Night in that environment strips away the visual cues that give you even the smallest sense of security during daylight hours. You could hear the water. You could hear the sounds of the bush around you. You could not always see what was moving in the shadows. Reports from the local area during that period were not comforting. Crocodile-related fatalities had occurred in the region. Not in film history books. Not in cautionary tales told years later. They were happening in real time, in the same general area where this production was setting up its cameras and asking its cast to perform dangerous sequences near the water's edge. That context sat over the entire shoot like a weight that no one could quite put down. The production team was not reckless. They understood what they were dealing with. Safety measures were put in place. But there is a particular kind of safety measure that tells you everything you need to know about how seriously a danger is being taken. When you station a person between an actress and the water with a loaded firearm, you are not taking symbolic precautions. You are acknowledging, plainly and directly, that the threat is real enough to require lethal force as a last resort. That is the measure that was in place during filming near the crocodile-infested water. A loaded magnum. A human being positioned between Linda Kozlowski and the animals in the water. Just in case. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it means to be an actress performing an emotional scene, trying to stay in character, trying to deliver the natural and believable reaction that the director needs, while somewhere just out of frame there is a person holding a firearm ready to shoot a massive prehistoric predator if it decides to move in your direction. That is not a movie. That is a survival situation dressed up as a movie. The sequence itself, the one where Sue Charlton comes face to face with the genuine menace of the Australian wilderness before Mick Dundee comes to her rescue, works so brilliantly on screen precisely because of what was actually happening. The crocodiles in that water were not props. They were not mechanical creatures operated by someone offstage. They were living animals, moving on their own instincts, responding to their environment in ways that no one could fully predict or control. There is a quality to genuine fear that is almost impossible to fake convincingly. Actors train for years to access authentic emotional responses. They study. They practice. They use technique and craft and memory and imagination to conjure feelings that the camera can then capture. But there is a level of raw, instinctive physical response to real danger that bypasses all of that training entirely. When your body recognizes a genuine threat, it reacts in ways that no amount of rehearsal can replicate. What audiences saw on screen when Linda Kozlowski's character faced those moments of peril was, in the most literal sense, real. Not manufactured. Not technique. Real. Her body was responding to actual danger with actual adrenaline. Her eyes were reading an environment that genuinely could have harmed her. The tension in every muscle, the specific quality of alertness in her expression, the way her movements carried a kind of heightened caution. All of that came from somewhere authentic because the situation demanded it. This is something that the people who worked on that film quietly understood. The crew members who stood at the edge of the water. The person holding the magnum. The production staff who watched the monitoring equipment and kept one eye on the footage and one eye on the tree line. They knew what was real. They knew what Linda was actually dealing with. And the general understanding was that this was not the kind of story you led with when promoting the film. You talked about the gorgeous Australian locations. You talked about Paul Hogan's infectious charm. You talked about the chemistry between the leads. You did not necessarily draw attention to the fact that the female star had been performing scenes within dangerous proximity of one of the world's most lethal predators with only a firearm and a prayer standing between her and disaster. Paul Hogan talked about Linda Kozlowski's behavior on set in ways that make it clear he was genuinely impressed. And Hogan was not a man who was easily rattled. He had a background that included real physical work and an easy comfort with the Australian environment that most people simply do not have. He was the kind of person for whom the Outback held familiarity rather than terror. And even he was struck by the way Linda handled the conditions around her. He described the expectation that most people had. That an actress, particularly an American actress without any particular background in wilderness survival, would have serious trouble managing the psychological weight of filming in that environment. That there would be complaints. That there would be moments of visible fear. That the demands of the shoot would wear her down in ways that showed up on camera. That expectation, according to everyone who was there, turned out to be completely wrong. Linda did not complain about the snakes. She did not make the insects into a drama. She did not turn the crocodiles into a crisis that disrupted the schedule or undermined the morale of the people around her. She adapted. She remained professional. She showed up every day and did her work with a consistency and calm that became, over time, one of the things the cast and crew quietly admired most about her. This is actually harder than it sounds. When you are genuinely frightened, when the fear is not something you are conjuring for the camera but something that arrives unbidden every time you step outside your door at night, maintaining a composed exterior requires real effort. It is a kind of emotional labor that does not get acknowledged in film reviews or award nominations, but that makes an enormous difference to the people working alongside you. The energy on a film set is deeply sensitive to the emotional state of the principal actors. When a lead performer is in distress, it spreads. When they are grounded and steady, that spreads too. Linda Kozlowski, whether consciously or not, gave the entire crew the steadiness they needed to keep moving through an extraordinarily difficult shoot. There is something in that story that says a great deal about who she actually was as a person. Not the character she played. Not the star that the publicity machine was building. The actual human being, a young woman far from home, in a genuinely dangerous environment, choosing day after day to be the calm in the room rather than the chaos. Something happens when people go through an intense shared experience. The bonds that form under pressure have a different quality than the ones that develop in comfortable, ordinary circumstances. There is a trust that builds between people who have faced real difficulty together, a knowledge of each other's character that you cannot gain in any other way. You learn who falls apart and who holds steady. You learn who can be counted on when things get genuinely hard. By the time Crocodile Dundee finished production, Linda Kozlowski and Paul Hogan had been through something together that very few people on Earth could fully understand. Not just the professional challenge of making a film. Not just the creative work of building characters and finding the right energy for scenes. They had lived through the Australian Outback at its most uncompromising. They had navigated real danger. They had shown each other something true about themselves under conditions that strip away pretense entirely. Is it any surprise that the chemistry between them on screen had a quality that felt different from the usual romantic pairing in a mainstream adventure film? What audiences responded to was not a performance of connection. It was connection itself, filtered through the lens of two people who had actually bonded in a real and significant way. You cannot entirely fake that. Audiences can feel the difference even when they cannot name it. The warmth between Sue Charlton and Mick Dundee in Crocodile Dundee came from somewhere genuine, and the somewhere genuine was a remote corner of the Australian wilderness where they had both been tested in ways the audience never fully knew about. The relationship that developed between them off-screen was the natural extension of what had begun in that environment. Hogan was nearly 20 years older. He had been married for a long time before the film brought them together. By the world's ordinary calculations, they were an unlikely pair. But the extraordinary circumstances of how they found each other gave their connection a foundation that the ordinary calculations do not account for. They had seen each other clearly. That matters more than most people acknowledge. The success of Crocodile Dundee was a gift that came with complications attached. Linda Kozlowski went from struggling for roles to being recognized everywhere she went. She became Sue Charlton in the public mind in a way that is both a blessing and a trap. The film earned extraordinary numbers at the box office globally, and her performance was a significant part of why it connected with audiences the way it did. But the movie industry's response to that success was to offer her more of the same thing, over and over again. The roles kept arriving with the same general description. The girlfriend. The woman in the orbit of the funny, charismatic male lead. The love interest. The person whose job is to look good beside the hero and provide the emotional anchor for his adventures. These were not entirely without merit as roles, but they were not the full range of what she wanted to explore as an actress. She had shown in Crocodile Dundee that she could carry intelligence and independence and genuine strength within a character. The industry's response was essentially to ignore that and offer her the same narrow template repeatedly. She pushed back on this. She said no to roles that felt like retreads. She held out for something more interesting, more complex, more worthy of the range she believed she had. And in doing so, she found herself in a difficult position. Because the sequels happened, and while they were commercially viable to varying degrees, they did not give her the creative expansion she was looking for. The franchise that had made her famous was also, in a very real sense, keeping her contained. Hollywood has a long and well-documented history of doing this to actresses, particularly those who emerge through one defining role. The industry has difficulty seeing beyond the thing that worked. It tends to want to reproduce the successful formula rather than explore what else the person at the center of it might be capable of. Linda Kozlowski was not the first woman to experience this particular frustration, and she would not be the last. But the clarity with which she named it and the decisiveness with which she eventually responded to it set her apart. When Crocodile Dundee in Los Angeles came and went in 2001, most observers read the results as a straightforward story of a franchise that had run out of road. Critics were unenthusiastic. Audiences were indifferent in numbers that showed at the box office. And shortly afterward, Linda Kozlowski stepped away from acting entirely. From the outside, it looked like defeat. A career that had once seemed so full of possibility, ending quietly with a disappointing film and no clear next chapter announced. That is how it got characterized in much of the coverage at the time. The girl from Crocodile Dundee, disappearing from view. But that framing missed something essential. Linda Kozlowski was not retreating. She was making a choice. A deliberate, considered, fully intentional choice about how she wanted to spend her life and what kind of meaning she wanted her days to have. She had spent years trying to make the industry work for her, to find the roles that would let her grow, to build a career that reflected her actual capacities. And she had found, through that experience, that the industry was not particularly interested in the terms she needed to feel fulfilled. So she stopped asking it to be something it was not. This is actually a much harder decision than it sounds. When you have built your identity around a profession, when you have worked for years to get to a place of recognition and success in it, walking away from that takes a particular kind of courage. There is a version of pride that says you keep fighting, keep pushing, keep trying to extract from the situation what you originally hoped for. And there is another kind of wisdom that says sometimes the brave thing is to recognize when your energy belongs somewhere else and to redirect it there without apology. She chose the second path. She chose her son, Chance. She chose a life that moved at a different rhythm than Hollywood demanded. And eventually, she chose Morocco. The story of what Linda Kozlowski built after leaving acting is, in many ways, more interesting than the story of how she became famous. Morocco arrived in her life as a discovery rather than a plan. She found herself drawn to a country that operated at a pace and with a beauty that felt like the antithesis of everything Hollywood had offered her. The culture, the landscape, the colors, the human scale of daily life there. Something in it matched what she had been looking for without knowing she was looking for it. She partnered with a local guide named Moulay Hafid Baba, and together they built Dream My Destiny, a luxury travel company offering immersive and personalized experiences throughout Morocco. This was not a passive investment or a celebrity brand project. This was hands-on work, creative work, the kind of work that requires genuine engagement with the material and with the people you are serving. She had found her next expression of herself, and it had nothing to do with any role anyone in Hollywood would have written for her. She talked in interviews about wanting to live on an olive farm outside Marrakesh, about running a donkey sanctuary. These are the kinds of details that stick with you because they reveal a person who had arrived somewhere real, somewhere that felt deeply personal and authentically chosen. Not the life that looked good on a press release. The life that actually made sense to her. Her financial situation after the divorce from Paul Hogan in 2014, a separation that was, by all accounts, handled with genuine mutual respect, left her in a stable and comfortable position. She had invested wisely. She had built something independent. And perhaps most importantly, she had done it on her own terms, without asking for anyone's permission or approval. Hogan has spoken with genuine warmth about her in the years since their separation. The care runs in both directions. That kind of enduring mutual regard after a significant relationship ends is not something everyone manages to hold on to, and it says something meaningful about the quality of character both of them brought to the years they shared. When you trace the full arc of Linda Kozlowski's story, from the frightened but composed actress performing near a crocodile-infested billabong, to the entrepreneur building a new life in the ancient landscapes of North Africa, something becomes clear. The lesson she drew from that terrifying Australian experience was not that the world is dangerous and should be approached with caution. It was almost the opposite. The Outback taught her that you can face something genuinely frightening and survive it with your dignity intact. It taught her that the professional composure you bring to impossible situations becomes its own kind of strength. It taught her that authenticity, the kind that arrives not because you are performing it but because circumstances demand the real version of you, is worth more than anything a publicist can manufacture. And it taught her that the most memorable moments in life are often the ones where what you are feeling is absolutely, uncomplicatedly real. She carried all of that forward. Through the years of Hollywood frustration. Through the complicated, beautiful, improbable relationship with Paul Hogan. Through the decision to leave a career that had defined her public identity. Through the reinvention in Morocco. The woman who stood near a crocodile-infested waterway with genuine fear coursing through her system while still somehow delivering the performance the scene required. That woman had a resilience in her that did not disappear when the cameras stopped rolling. When people sit down to watch Crocodile Dundee today, they see a charming adventure comedy with iconic moments and a wonderful chemistry between its two leads. They see a window into 1980s pop culture and a time when a simple story told with genuine warmth could reach audiences all over the world. They see Linda Kozlowski as Sue Charlton, bright and capable and real, holding her own in a story that could easily have reduced her to just the love interest. What they almost never know, because the people who were there had reasons not to talk about it in detail, is what it actually cost to make some of those scenes. What was standing between Linda Kozlowski and the water? What was moving beneath the surface while the cameras were rolling? What the person with the loaded firearm was watching while everyone else was watching the monitor? What Linda herself was managing internally, in the private space between genuine fear and professional performance, while still delivering the scenes that audiences would remember for decades. That hidden layer of the story is part of what makes it so worth knowing, because it changes something about how you understand what you are watching. The fear in her eyes was not acting. The tension in those sequences came from somewhere real. The authentic emotional quality that made audiences connect with that film and with her performance was, in the most literal sense, rooted in actual experience. She was not imagining danger. She was standing in it. And she stood in it without complaint, without drama, with the kind of steady professionalism that the crew around her quietly relied on. Hollywood tells a lot of stories about itself. It is very good at manufacturing mythology around its productions, its stars, its iconic moments. The real stories, the ones that involve genuine difficulty and genuine courage and genuine human messiness, tend to stay quieter. They get mentioned in passing. They surface occasionally in interviews that most people do not see. They become part of the oral history of a production without ever quite making it into the official version. The real story of what Linda Kozlowski went through during Crocodile Dundee is one of those quieter histories. It did not make the promotional materials. It did not become part of how the film was sold to audiences. But it became, in a very real way, part of what made the film work. Part of what gave it the texture and authenticity that you can sense even when you cannot explain where it is coming from. And her story after that film is equally worth knowing. The choices she made, the things she rejected, the life she built when Hollywood's narrow definition of who she could be stopped feeling like enough, all of it adds up to a portrait of a woman who refused to be reduced. Who understood that the most interesting version of herself existed outside the roles she was offered, and who had the courage to go find it. The scene where no one was supposed to notice that the danger was real. The career where no one was supposed to notice that she was bored and constrained. The life after fame where no one quite expected her to find something better. She managed all of it with the same quality she brought to that waterfront in the Australian Outback. Steady. Clear-eyed. Completely, uncomplicatedly real. And that, more than any single film credit or red carpet moment, is the thing about Linda Kozlowski that actually deserves to be remembered.